The rights question. Can and should robots have rights? I'm David Gunkel, Distinguished Teaching Professor at Northern Illinois University. A few years ago, I posted this picture online in an effort to initiate debate about the moral and legal standing of technological artifacts like AI and robots. Responses to the image were, as you might imagine, polarizing, with advocates and critics lining up on both sides of the issue. In fact, what I did not fully appreciate at the time is that this subject is something like the abortion question in robotics, a divisive issue that produces very strong opinions both for and against. In response, I've now written a book which attempts to investigate and analyze this phenomenon. Instead of attempting to replay the rather detailed argument that's developed in the text, which would be nearly impossible to do in the 20 minutes that I have today, what I want to do will be more of an overview of the project's approach and its consequences. The investigated is motivated and framed by a rather simple inquiry. Can and should robots have rights? Responding to this question, however, turns out to be rather involved, so here's my plan. First, I'll begin by asking about the question. For many theorists and practitioners, the question of robot rights has been declared to be simply unthinkable. My question is why? Why is the question declared to be unthinkable? And what does it mean when inquiry is dismissed or marginalized by this kind of declaration? Second, I want to look at and analyze the form of the question itself. There is an important philosophical difference between the two modal verbs that organize the inquiry, can and should. This difference has considerable history behind it and influences what is asked about and how. Third, capitalizing on this verbal distinction, I will identify and evaluate the four possible modalities concerning artifacts and the question of rights. This will take the form of a kind of cost-benefit analysis of the available thinking on this matter. Finally, I'll conclude by proposing another alternative, a way of thinking otherwise that effectively challenges the rules of the game and provides for other ways of theorizing moral standing that can scale to the unique challenges and opportunities that are confronted in the face of the robot. Part 1. Thinking the Unthinkable. This has been the standard response to the question of robot rights. Not even a proposal for rights, but the mere question concerning the moral and legal status of non-human artifacts. Versions of this kind of reaction circulate in the work of many noted and well-situated experts in the field. We see it, for instance, in the work of Noel Sharkey, who calls it a distraction and fairy tale stuff. Ellen Winfield, who dismisses it as something no one in the field would take seriously. Luciano Floridi, who finds talk about the subject to be distracting and irresponsible. And there's many others. As David Levy has accurately described it, the very notion of robot having rights is unthinkable. Unthinkable not only in terms of not being able to be thought by way of the available conceptual apparatus, specifically the instrumental theory of technology, but also in the sense that it is something to be deliberately avoided and not submitted to thought, insofar as it is considered to be a distraction, a waste of time, or fairy tale stuff. For many in the field, the question of robot rights or the legal status of AI is a kind of shiny object that attracts attention, but is not worth the effort of serious scientific thinking. And to make matters worse, these dismissals are more often than not issued as declarations and typically not supported by sufficient evidence or argument. And the book dedicates an entire chapter to analyzing this avoidance behavior as it is manifested in the current literature. My worry in all of this is that purposefully avoiding a question by declaring it to be unthinkable sounds more like an effort to protect existing orthodoxies than it does like rigorous science. Instead of dismissing the question as unthinkable, it would be better to ask, to investigate, and to make an informed decision based not on preconceived notions and prejudice, but on actual evidence and data. Part 2, the is-ought problem. Our question consists of two separate queries. Can robots have rights, which is a question that asks about the capabilities of a particular entity, and should robots have rights, which is a question that inquires about obligations in the face of this entity. These two questions involve and operationalize a rather famous conceptual distinction in moral philosophy that is called the is-ought problem, or Hume's guillotine. In a treatise of human nature, David Hume differentiated between two kinds of statements: descriptive statements of fact and normative statements of value. For Hume, the problem was not just the fact that we often fail to distinguish the two, but that we mistakenly try to derive the ought from the is. Since Hume, there have been numerous attempts to resolve this problem by bridging the gap that separates the ontological is from the moral ought. Despite these efforts, however, the problem remains and is considered to be one of those important and intractable philosophical dilemmas that people still write books about. The guiding question of our inquiry simply utilizes modal verbs and therefore articulates a modified version of the is-ought problem. The modal verb can indicates an ontological question about the factual capabilities or the properties of the entity, while should inquires about axiological issues having to do with obligations in the face of this entity. Following Hume, we are able to make the following distinction then between two different kinds of statements. Statement 1, which is an ontological proposition, and Statement 2, which is an axiological proposition. By affirming or denying each one of these statements in different combinations, we can derive four options or modalities concerning the moral situation of robots and other artifacts. So, in the third stage here, let's look at all four combinations, or what I call the modalities of robot rights. In the first case, we deny or negate both statements. Robots are incapable of having rights, and for this reason, robots should not have rights. This is a position that is formulated by strictly applying the instrumental theory of technology. According to Martin Heidegger's analysis in the question concerning technology, the presumed role and function of any kind of technology, whether it be the product of handicraft or industrialized manufacture, is that it is a means employed by human users for specific ends. Heidegger calls this particular characterization the instrumental definition, and he indicates that it forms what is considered to be the correct understanding of any kind of technological contrivance or artifact. As Deborah Johnson accurately describes it, computer systems are produced, distributed, and used by people engaged in social practices and meaningful pursuits. This is as true of current computer systems as it will be of future computer systems. No matter how independently, automatic, and interactive computer systems of the future behave, they will be the products, direct or indirect, of human behavior, human social institutions, and human decision. Now, this way of thinking is persuasive, precisely because it affirms long-standing assumptions about human exceptionalism and technological instrumentalism. Technologies, no matter how sophisticated, interactive, or social they appear to be, are just tools, nothing more. The problem, of course, is that this position is disputed by much of the available data produced by and derived from human-robot interaction studies. The computer as social actor experiments undertaken by Byron Reeves and Clifford Nass, the documented experiences of soldiers working with explosive ordnance disposal robots, and numerous HRI studies undertaken by social scientists. To put it in a quick vernacular form, even when our head tells us it's just a robot, our heart cannot help but like it. The flip side to this strict instrumentalist position is to affirm both statements. That is, robots are now or will soon be capable of having rights, and therefore robots should have rights. This is the position espoused by many who support speculative ideas or hypotheses like the singularity, superintelligence, and artificial general intelligence, or AGI. The artificial intelligence programs in practical use today, Ben Goertzel admits, are sufficiently primitive in their morality or otherwise, and it's not a serious issue. But that will not remain for long. Not too far in the future, however, things are going to be different. AIs will possess true artificial general intelligence, not necessarily emulating human intelligence, but equally and likely surpassing it. At this point, the morality or otherwise of AGIs will become a highly significant issue. There are obvious advantages to this way of thinking insofar as it does not simply deny rights to robots, but it kicks the problem down the road and postpones decision making. Right now, we do not have robots that can be moral subjects, but when we do, then we will need to consider whether they should be treated differently. This wait-and-see approach also helps us contend with the moral intuitions we have in the face of social robots. Although these mechanisms are intentionally designed to trigger our emotions, we should remember, for now at least, that inside the box there's nothing. No thought, no consciousness, no sentience. If and when these machines can achieve something more, then we will be justified in considering the rights question. But for now, these social behaviors are just cleverly manipulated effects without a real cause. The main problem with this way of proceeding is that it, like the instrumentalist argument, commits the is-ought fallacy, seeking to derive the ought from a prior determination of is. It says, in effect, as long as our robots are not conscious or sentient or whatever ontological condition or property counts, no worries. Once they achieve this capability, however, then and only then should we consider extending some level of moral concern. Which means that this solution is less a solution and more a decision not to decide, which is why this way of thinking gets plenty of traction in our speculative science fiction. In opposition to these two approaches, there are other responses that seek to uphold the is-ought distinction by affirming one statement while denying the other. Since there are two statements, the strategy can take one of two forms. In the first version, one affirms that robots can have rights, but denies that this fact requires us to accord them social or moral standing. This is the argument that has been developed by Joanna Bryson, beginning with the provocatively titled essay, Robots Should Be Slaves. Bryson's argument goes like this. Robots are property. No matter how capable they are, appear to be, or may become, we are obligated not to be obligated by them. Or as she describes it in a more recent article, it is unquestionably within our society's capacity to define robots and other AI as moral agents and patients. In fact, many authors, both philosophers and technologists, are currently working on this project. It may be technically possible to create AI that would meet contemporary requirements for both agency or patiency. But even if it is possible, neither of these two statements make it either necessary or desirable that we should do so. Now, to its credit, this approach succeeds insofar as it reasserts and reconfirms the instrumentalist theory in the face of perceived challenges from a new kind of socially interactive artifact. No matter how interactive or seemingly intelligent our robots and AIs are or can become, they should, now and forever, be considered instruments serving our needs and our desires, nothing more. There are, however, at least two problems with this decision. First, it requires a kind of asceticism or abstinence education. Bryson's text issues imperatives that take the form of social prohibitions for both designers and users. For designers, thou shalt not create robots to be companions. For users, no matter how interactive or capable a robot is or can become, thou shalt not treat your robot as yourself. These prohibitions, however, have been disputed and disproven by actual data concerning human-robot interaction, from the CASA studies conducted in the mid-1990s to recent robot abuse investigations. Even though we know better, we respond to and treat many artifacts with respect. This is not a bug to be fixed. It is a feature of human social interaction. It is, in fact, the condition of possibility for all forms of sociality. Second, this way of thinking has been formulated in terms of slavery, or what has been called a slave metaphor, which I should point out is not limited to Bryson's work. It appears in all kinds of other publications addressing this matter, including the work of Luciano Floridi and Houghton Ashrafian. Now, the problem here is not the usual concern over how the robot might feel about its subjugation. The problem is with us and the effect this kind of institutionalized servitude would have on us and our social institutions. As both the philosophical and historical studies have shown, institutionalized forms of servitude or slavery have adverse effects on those who occupy the position of mastery. The final modality also preserves the separation between the two statements, but it does so by denying the first and affirming the second. In this case, which is something proposed and developed by Kate Darling, robots, at least in terms of the currently available technology, cannot have rights. They do not, at least at this particular point in time, possess the necessary capabilities or properties to be considered full moral persons. Despite this fact, they should, Darling argues, still be granted some level of moral and even legal status. Looking at the state-of-the-art technology, Darling points out, our robots are nowhere close to the intelligence and complexity of humans or animals, nor will they reach this stage in the near future. And yet, while it seems far-fetched for a robot's legal status to differ from that of a toaster, there is already a noticeable difference in how we interact with certain types of robotic objects. This is, Darling argues, due to our tendencies to anthropomorphize technological objects by projecting into them cognitive capabilities, emotions, and motivations that do not necessarily exist. And social robots, Darling continues, play off this tendency by mimicking cues that we automatically associate with certain states of mind or feelings. Even in today's primitive form, this can elicit emotional reactions from people that are similar, for instance, to how we react to animals and to each other. This necessitates, Darling concludes, new obligations in the face of robots that are at least on par with what we have extended to non-human animals. The obvious advantage to this way of thinking is that it is able to scale to recent challenges in our moral intuitions. Even if robots cannot be moral subjects, strictly speaking, at least not yet, there is something qualitatively different about socially interactive artifacts. Unlike some of the previous modalities, Darling's proposal tries to work with, rather than against, recent empirical experiences with robots. There are, however, at least two problems with this approach. First, it reaffirms one of Hume's criticisms that distinctions of vice and virtue are founded merely on the relations of objects, rendering moral decisions little more than expressions of personal interest and emotion. It is because we perceive the toaster and the social robot differently that we should, according to Darling's argument, consider extending some level of legal protections to the latter, but not the former. But such perceptions can be capricious, inconsistent, and deliberately manipulated. Second, this proposal remains thoroughly anthropocentric and instrumentalizes others. According to Darling, the principal reason we need to consider extending rights to others, like animals and robots, is because of the way it makes us feel. This follows Immanuel Kant's indirect duties argument for restricting animal abuse, and Darling endorses this anthropocentric formulation without any critical hesitation whatsoever. Because of these complications, it is, I believe, necessary to formulate a mode of response that is devised and oriented otherwise. This alternative proceeds by taking aim at and deconstructing the ruling conceptual opposition that organizes the entire spectrum of possible responses, the is-ought distinction inherited from David Hume. The principal question for Hume, and the fundamental organizing principle of the four modalities of robot rights that we've just considered and analyzed, is determining whether and to what extent ought may be derived from is. As long as we play the game according to this set of rules, little will change. Each alternative will continue to heap up arguments and evidence in support of their particular positions. But the basic problem and the debate will remain essentially unchanged. So I suggest we flip the script and consider not how ought may be derived from is, but rather how is only able to be derived from a prior ought. This is precisely the innovation introduced by Manuel Levinas, who in direct opposition to the usual way of thinking asserts that ethics precedes ontology. In other words, the moral aspect, the ought dimension, comes first, in terms of both temporal sequence and status, and then the ontological dimension follows from it. This is a deliberately provocative statement that cuts across the grain of the philosophical tradition. As Floridi correctly points out, in most moral theory, what something is largely determines its moral value. In other words, we first need to know what something is, what capabilities it has or cannot have, before making any decisions about how it is to be treated, whether it is just a thing that can be used and disposed of as we desire, or whether it is another social subject who counts and can be benefited or harmed by our decisions and actions. Levinas deliberately inverts this entire transaction. According to his way of thinking, we are first confronted with a mess of anonymous users and anonymous others who intrude on us and to whom we are obligated to respond even before we know anything at all about them. It is only after having made a response in the face of the other that it becomes possible to decide who or what they are. In Hume's terminology, we are first obligated to respond, and then, after having made a response, what or who we responded to is able to be determined and identified. The advantage to this way of thinking is that it provides an entirely different way of looking at the challenges, not just of robots, but of the way we have addressed and decided things in the face of this challenge. As we encounter and interact with others, whether they be other human persons, an animal, the natural environment, or a robot, this other entity is first and foremost situated in relationship to us. Consequently, the question of moral status does not necessarily depend on what the other is in its essence, but on how he, she, he, it, they supervene before us, and how we decide in the face of the other to make a response. In this transaction, relations are prior to the things related, instituting what Mark Cockleberg has called a relational turn in ethics. But this proposal, for all its promise to formulate an ethics that is situated otherwise, also has costs, especially as it applies to technological artifacts. First, it has to fight against and struggle to break free from the gravitational pull of Levinas's own moral theory. Whatever the import of his unique contribution, other in Levinas is still unabashedly and dogmatically anthropocentric. Consequently, the alternative I'm presenting here will only able to be successful insofar as it actively works against and in excess of the inescapable anthropocentrism that we already find operative in Levinas's own work. Fortunately, there is a precedent for this kind of effort to use Levinas against Levinas, or to radicalize Levinas's work in an effort to address the moral challenges of other forms of otherness, animals, the environment, artifacts, and machines. Second, operationalizing this Levinasian approach requires an entirely different way of thinking about moral status and decisions that are made concerning who counts as a socially significant other and what does not. As a result, the challenge or the opportunity of the robot is not just determining how we can or should adjust our moral theories to respond to this other kind of social other. Instead, what we see in the face or in the faceplate of the robot is nothing less than a fundamental challenge to the way these theories have been formulated in the first place, and how they usually operate, requiring us to perform a thorough reconsideration of moral philosophy that goes all the way down. Robots, especially increasingly social artifacts, are therefore not just one more problem for moral philosophy. They show us the principal problem and unique challenges of moral philosophy itself. So to recap, asking about robot rights is not a distraction, fairy tale stuff, or a waste of time. It is especially needed and necessary in the face of socially interactive artifacts that effectively challenge the standard operating procedures for dealing with technology. The question, Can and Should Robots Have Rights calls on and operationalizes a classic philosophical problem inherited from David Hume. Responses to this question take one of four forms, but all four modalities of response have significant problems or complications. In response to this, I've argued for another alternative, a mode of thinking otherwise that capitalizes on the philosophical innovations of Emmanuel Levinas and others who follow his lead. If a picture is worth 1,000 words, then I will leave you with this: a conceptual map of the territory of robot rights as it is currently formulated. On the left-hand side of the image, you have those who dismiss the entire issue as unthinkable. In the center, we have what I call the is-ought variations, 4 different ways to think the unthinkable, producing the 4 modalities of robot rights. And on the other side of the image, on the right side, there are those efforts to respond to the demonstrated problems of the is-ought variations by pursuing an alternative that can be called thinking otherwise. So that's all I have. If you'd like to explore these matters further, obviously there's the book, but I would be happy to take your questions now or via email after today. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your comments.